Man of the Crowd by Edgar Allan Poe. It was well said of a certain German book that ehrlich sich nicht lesen. It does not permit itself to be read. There are some secrets which do not permit themselves to be told. Men die nightly in their beds, wringing the hands of ghostly confessors and looking them piteously in the eyes, die with despair of heart and convulsions of throat on account of the hideousness of mysteries which will not suffer themselves to be revealed. Now and then, alas, the conscience of man takes up a burden so heavy in horror that it can be thrown down only into the grave, and thus the essence of all crime is undivulged. Not long ago, about the closing in of an evening in an autumn, I sat at the large bow window of the D Coffee House in London. For some months I had been ill in health, but was now convalescent, and with returning strength found myself in one of those happy moods which are so precisely the converse of ennui, the moods of keenness and attendancy, and when the film from the mental vision departs, the intellect, electrified, surpasses as greatly its everyday condition as does the vivid yet candid reason of Leibniz, the mad and flimsy rhetoric of Gorgias. Merely to breathe was an enjoyment, and I derived positive pleasure even from many of the legitimate sources of pain. I felt a calm but inquisitive interest in everything. With a cigar in my mouth and a newspaper in my lap, I had been amusing myself for the greater part of the afternoon, now in poring over advertisements, now in observing the promiscuous company in the room, and now in peering through the smoky panes into the street. This latter is one of the principal thoroughfares of the city, and had been very much crowded during the whole day, but as the darkness came on, the throng momentarily increased, and by the time the lamps were well lighted, two dense, continuous tides of population were rushing past the door. At this particular period of the evening, I had never been before in a similar situation, and the tumultuous sea of human heads filled me, therefore, with a delicious novelty of emotion. I gave up at length all care of things within the hotel, and became absorbed in contemplation of the scene without. At first, my observations took an abstract and generalizing turn. I looked at the passengers in masses and thought of them in aggregate relations. Soon, however, I descended to details and regarded with minute interest the innumerable varieties of figure, dress, air, gaunt visage, and expression of countenance. By far the greater number of those who went by had a satisfied, business-like demeanor, and seemed to be thinking only of making their way through the press. Their brows were knit, and their eyes rolled quickly when pushed against by fellow wayfarers. They evinced no symptoms of impatience, but adjusted their clothes and hurried on. Others, still in a numerous class, were restless in their movements, had flushed faces, and talked and gesticulated to themselves, as if feeling in solitude and on account of the very denseness of company around. When impeded in their progress, these people suddenly ceased muttering, but redoubled their gesticulations, and awaited, with an absence and overdone smile upon their lips, the course of the persons impeding them. If jostled, they bowed profusely to the jostlers, and appeared overwhelmed with confusion. There was nothing very distinctive about the two large classes beyond what I have noted. Their habiliments belonged to that order which is pointedly termed the decent. They were undoubtedly noblemen, merchants, attorneys, tradesmen, stock jobbers, the empyreans and commonplaces of society, the men of leisure and men actively engaged in affairs of their own, conducting business upon their own responsibility. They did not greatly excite my attention. The tribe of clerks was an obvious one, and I here discern two remarkable divisions. There were the junior clerks of flash houses, and young gentlemen with tight coats and bright boots, well-oiled hair, and supercilious smiles, setting aside a certain dapperness of carriage, which may be termed Deschian, for want of a better word. The manner of those persons seemed to me an exact facsimile of what had been the perfection of bon ton about 12 or 18 months before. They wore the cast-off graces of gentry, and this, I believe, involves the best definition of the class, the division of the upper clerks of staunch firms or of steady old fellows it was not possible to mistake. These were known by their coats and pantaloons of black or brown, made to sit comfortably, with white cravats and waistcoats, broad, solid-looking shoes, and thick hose or gaiters. They all had slightly bald heads, from which the right ears, long used to pen-holding, had an odd habit of standing off on an end, and I observed that they always removed or settled their hats with both hands, and wore watches with short gold chains of substantial and ancient pattern. Theirs was the affection of responsibility, if indeed there was an affection so honorable. There were many individuals of dashing appearance, whom I easily understood as belonging to a race of swell pickpockets, with which all great cities are infested. I watched these gentry with much inquisitiveness and found it difficult to imagine they should ever be mistaken for gentlemen by gentlemen themselves. Their voluminousness, the wristband with an air of excessive frankness, should betray them at once. The gamblers, of whom I decreed not a few, were still more easily recognizable. They wore every variety of dress, from that of the desperate thimble-ring bully with a velvet waistcoat, fancy neckerchief, gilt chains, and filigreed buttons, to that of the scrupulously inornate clergyman than which nothing could be less than liable to suspicion. Still, all were distinguished by a certain sodden swarthiness of complexion, the filmy dimness of eye, a pallor and compression of lip. There were two other traits, moreover, which I could already detect them: a guarded loweredness of tone of conversation, and a more than ordinary extension of the thumb in the direction of right angles with the fingers. Very often in company with these sharpers, I observed an order of men somewhat different in habits, but still birds of a kindred feather. They may be defined as the gentlemen who live by their wits. They seem to pry on the public of two battalions, that of the dandies and that of the military men. Of the first grade, the leading figures are long locks and smiles. Of the second, frogged coats and frowns. Descending in the scale of what is termed gentility, I found darker and deeper themes for speculation. I saw Jew peddlers with hawk eyes flashing from countenances whose every other feature wore an expression of abject humility. Sturdy professional street beggars, scowling upon mendicants of a better stamp, whose despair alone had driven forth into the night for charity. Feeble and ghastly invalids, upon whom death had placed a sure hand, and who sidled and tottered through the mob, looking everyone beseechingly in the face, as if in a search of some chance consolation, some lost hope. Modest young girls returning from long and late labors to a cheerless home, and shrieking more tearfully than indignantly from the glances of ruffians whose direct eye contact even could not be avoided. Women of the town, of all kinds and of all ages, the unequivocal beauty in the prime of her womanhood, putting one in mind of the stature of Lucian with the surface of Parian marble, and the interior filled with filth, the lonesome and utterly lost leper in rags, the wrinkled, bejeweled, and paint-begrimed beldam making the last effort at youth. The mere child of immature form, yet from long association and in depth and in dreadful quackeries of her trade, and burning with a rabid ambition to be ranked equal of her elders in vice. Drunkards innumerable and indescribable, some in shreds and patches, reeling and articulate, with bruised visages and lackluster eyes, some in whole although filthy garments, with a slightly unsteady swagger, thick sensual lips, and hardy-looking rubicund faces, others clothed in materials which had once been good, and which now even were scrupulously well brushed, men who walked with more than naturally firm and springy step, but whose countenances were fearfully pale, whose eyes hideously wild and red, who clutched with quivering fingers as they strode through the crowd at every object which came within their reach. Beside these, pie men, porters, coal heavers, sweepers, organ grinders, monkey exhibitors, ballad mongers, and those who vented with those who sang, ragged artisans and exhausted laborers of every description, and a full and noisy and inornate viscosity which jarred discordantly upon the ear and gave an aching sensation to the eye. As the night deepened, so deepened to me the interest of the scene. For not only did the general character of the crowd materially alter, its gentler features retiring and gradual withdrawal of the more orderly portion of the people, and its harsher ones coming out into bolder relief. And as the late hour brought forth every species of infamy from its den. But the rays of the gas lamps, feeble at first in their struggle with the dying day, had now at length gained ascendancy and threw over everything a fitful garnish luster. All was dark, yet splendid, as that ebony with which had been likened the style of Churchillian. The wild effects of light enchained me to an examination of individual faces, and although the rapidity which the world of light fitted before the window prevented me from casting more than a glance at each visage, still it seemed that in this particular mental state I was in, I frequently read, even in that brief interval of a glance, the history of long years. With my brow to the glass, I was thus occupied in scrutinizing the mob, when suddenly there came into view a countenance, that of a decrepit old man, some 65 or 70 years of age, a countenance which at once arrested and absorbed my whole attention, on account of the absolute idiosyncrasy of its expression. Anything even remotely resembling that expression I had never seen before. I well remember that my first thought upon beholding it was that the recent that had viewed it would have greatly preferred it to its own pictorial incarnations of the fiend. As I endeavored during the brief minute of my original survey to form some analysis of the meaning conveyed, there arose confusingly and paradoxically within my mind the ideas of vast mental power, of caution, of penuriousness, of avarice, of cruelness, of malice, of bloodthirstiness, of triumph, of merriment, of excessive terror, of intense, of supreme despair. I felt singularly aroused, startled, fascinated, How wild a history, I said to myself, is written within that bosom. Then came a craving desire to keep that man in view, to know more of him. Hurriedly, putting on my overcoat, seizing my hat and cane, I made my way into the street and pushed through the crowd in the direction which I had seen him take, for he had already disappeared. With some little difficulty, I at length came within sight of him, approached and followed him closely, yet cautiously, as not to attract his attention. I had now a good opportunity of examining his person. He was short in stature, very thin, and apparently very feeble, his clothes generally very filthy and ragged. But he came now and then within the strong glare of a lamp. I perceived that his linen, although dirty, was of beautiful texture, and my vision deceived me, or though a rant in close-buttoned and evidently second-handed ricotiere, which enveloped him, I caught a glimpse both of a diamond and of a dagger. These observations heightened my curiosity, and I resolved to follow this stranger whitherso, wherever he should go. It was now full nightfall, and a thick humid fog hung over the city, soon ending in a settled and heavy rain. This change of weather had an odd effect upon the crowd, the whole of which was at once put into a new commotion and overshadowed by a world of umbrellas. The waver, the jostler, and the hum increased in a tenfold degree. For my own part, I did not much regard the rain, the lurking of an old fever in the system, rendering the moisture somewhat too dangerously pleasant. Tying a handkerchief around my mouth, I kept on. For some half an hour the old man held his way with difficulty among the great thoroughfare, and I here walked close to him, close to his elbow, for fear of losing sight of him. Never once turning his head to look back, he did not observe me. By and by he passed into a cross street which, although densely filled with people, was not quite so thronged as the main one he had quitted. Here a change in his demeanor became evident. He walked more slowly, and with less object than before, more hesitantly. He crossed and recrossed the way repeatedly without apparent aim, and the press was still so thick that every such movement I was obliged to follow him closely. The street was narrow, and the long one, and his course lay within it for nearly an hour, during which the passengers had gradually diminished to about that number which is ordinarily seen at noon in Broadway near the park. So vast a difference there is between a London populace and that of the most frequented American city. A second turn brought us into a square, brilliantly lighted and overflowing with life, and the old manner of the stranger reappeared. His chin fell upon his breast, while his eyes rolled wildly from under his knitted brow in every direction, upon who hemmed him in. He urged his way steadiously, perseveringly. I was surprised, however, to find upon him, his having made the circuit of the square, that he had turned and retraced his steps. Still more, I was astonished to see him repeat the same walk several times, once nearly detecting me as he came round the corner with sudden movement. In this exercise he spent another hour, at the end of which we met with far less interruptions from passengers than the first. The rain fell fast, the air grew cool, and the people were retiring to their homes with a gesture of impatience. The wanderer passed into a by-street comparatively deserted. Down this, some quarter of a mile long, he rushed with an activity I could not have dreamed of seeing in one so aged, and which put me to much trouble in pursuit. A few minutes brought us into a large and busy bazaar with the localities of which the stranger appeared well acquainted, and where his original demeanor again became apparent. He forced his way to and fro without aim and among the host of buyers and sellers during the hour and a half or thereabouts which we passed in this place. It required much caution to my part to keep him within reach, but without attracting his observation. Luckily, I wore a pair of courteous overshoes, and I could move or about in perfect silence. At no moment did he see that I watched him. He entered shop after shop, priced nothing, spoke no word, and looked at all the objects in a wild and vacant stare. I was now utterly amazed at his behavior, and firmly resolved that we should not part until I had satisfied myself in some measure in respecting him. A loud-toned clock struck 11, and the company were fast deserting the bazaar. A shopkeeper, in putting up the shutters, jostled the old man, and in an instant I saw a strong shudder come over him. He hurried into the street and looked anxiously around him for an instant, and then ran with incredible speed through many crooked and peopleless lanes until we emerged once more in the great thoroughfare of whence we had started, the street of the D Hotel. It was no longer wore, however, the same aspect. It still brilliantly lit with gas, but the rain fell fiercely, and it were few persons less to be seen. The stranger grew pale. He walked moodily some paces up the once populous avenue, and then with a heavy sigh turned in the direction of the river, and plunging through the great variety of devious ways, came out at length in view of one of the most principal theaters. It was about to be closed, and the audience was thronging from the doors. I saw the old man gasp as if for breath, while he threw himself amid the crowd. But I thought that the intense agony of his countenance had in some measure abated. His head fell again upon his breast. He appeared as I had seen him at first. I observed that he now took the course in which had gone the greater number of the audience, but upon the whole, I was at a loss to comprehend the waywardness of his actions. As he proceeded, the company grew more scattered, and his old uneasiness and vacillations were resumed. For some time he followed closely a party of 10 or 12 roysters, but from this number one by one dropped off until 3 only remained together in a narrow and gloomy lane less frequented. The stranger paused, and for a moment lost in thought, then with every mark of agitation pursued rapidly a route which brought us to the verge of the city, amid regions very different from those which we had hitherto traversed. It was the most noisome quarter of London, where everything wore the worst impress of the most deplorable poverty, and the more desperate of crime. By the dim light of the accidental lamp, tall, antique, worm-eaten tenements were seen tottering to their fall in directions so many and corporeous and scarce, and the semblance of the passage was discernible between them. The paving stones lay at random, displayed from their beds by the rankly growing grass. Horrible filth festered in the dammed-up gutters. The whole atmosphere teemed with desolation. Yet as we proceeded, the sounds of human life, revered by some degrees, and at length large bands of the most abandoned of the London populace were seen reeling to and fro. The spirits of the old man again flickered up, as a lamp which is near to its death hour. Once more he strode upward with elastic tread. Suddenly a corner was turned, a blaze of light burst upon our sight, and we stood before one of the huge suburban temples of Intimidance and one of the places of the fiend, Gin. It was now nearly daybreak, but a number of wretched inebriates still pressed in and out of the flaunching entrance. With a half shriek of joy, the old man forced a passage within, resumed at once to his original bearing, and stalked backward and forward without apparent object among the throng. He had not been thus long occupied, however, before a rush to the doors gave token that the host was closing them for the night. It was something even more intense than despair that I then observed upon the countenance of the singular being whom I had watched so pretentiously. Yet he did not hesitate in his career, but with a mad energy retraced his steps at once to the heart of the mighty London. Long and swiftly he fled, while I followed him in the wildest amazement, resolute not to abandon a scrutiny in which I had now felt an intense, all-absorbing. The sun arose while we proceeded, and when we had once again reached the most thronged mat of the populous town, the street of the D Hotel, in present an appearance of human bustle and activity scarcely inferior to what I had seen on the evening before, and here long amid the momentarily increasing confusion did I persist in my pursuit of the stranger. But as usual, he walked to and fro, and during the day did not pass from out of the turmoil of the street. And as the shades of the second evening came on, I grew wary upon death, and stopping fully in front of the wanderer, gazed at him steadfastly in the face. He noticed me not, but resumed his solemn walk, while I, ceasing to follow, remained absorbed in contemplation. "This old man," I said, at length, "is the type and the genius of deep crime. He refuses to be alone. He is the man of the crowd. It will be in vain to follow, for I shall learn no more of him, nor of his deeds. The worst heart of the wound is a grosser book than the Horlithius Ami, and perhaps it is but of the greatest mercies of God that Irlich sie nicht lesen."